the first time Helen Pritchard saw Simon Bishop. He was pulling a man out of the mud by the collar of his shirt and setting him back on his feet with the kind of rough efficiency that left no room for thanks or ceremony. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas stood at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning into a hard wind. Cattle drives pushed through in great thundering rivers of dust and horn, and the town swelled and shrank with the seasons the way a lung breathes. Saloons never fully closed, the jail never fully emptied, and the wide, churned Main Street ate boots whole when the rains came through in April. Helen had arrived on the stage from Wichita 3 days prior. She carried a single trunk, a leather satchel, and a letter of employment from the Caldwell Schoolhouse Committee, who had been 2 years without a teacher following the untimely departure of the last one. A man named Patterson who had, by all accounts, decided that teaching arithmetic to the children of cattle hands and homesteaders was a lesser calling than prospecting in Colorado. Helen was 24 years old. She had a practical face that men sometimes mistook for plain until she looked directly at them, at which point they generally revised their assessment. Her hair was brown and thick, and she kept it pinned with a discipline that the Kansas wind treated as a personal challenge. She had grown up in Lawrence, Kansas, the daughter of a schoolteacher herself, and she carried her mother's conviction that education was the only reliable thing a person could give another person that could not be taken away by weather or ill fortune or a poor hand at cards. She had not expected Simon Bishop. He was standing in the street on that first morning when she walked from Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house to the schoolhouse to assess what she was working with, and the man he had pulled from the mud was young, barely older than a boy, and the young man was stammering something between gratitude and alarm, as Simon set him upright with hands that seemed capable of bending iron. Simon Bishop was 31 years old and built like the land itself, wide across the shoulders, rough-handed, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from one of the limestone outcroppings that rose from the Kansas flats. He wore his dark hair a little too long and his shirt a little too open at the collar, and there was a badge pinned to his vest that caught the thin April light. Town Marshal. He had been Town Marshal of Caldwell for 2 years, and in those 2 years he had buried 3 men, jailed 14 others, run off a cattle-rustling operation that had cost the county considerable livestock, and was generally regarded as the most effective and least sociable lawman the county had seen in recent memory. He did not smile at the young man he had pulled from the mud. He checked him over with a brief, efficient look the way a man checks a horse for injury, thorough but without sentiment, and said, "Next time, watch where you're walking when the herds come through." And then he turned and walked back the way he had come without waiting to see whether the young man appreciated the advice. Helen watched all of this from the board sidewalk across the street and thought, that man does not know the meaning of the word gentle. She did not think it with dislike exactly. She thought it the way you think a fact. The sky is wide. The trail is long. That man does not know how to be gentle. Then she put him out of her mind and went to see her schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was better than she had feared and worse than she had hoped. The building was sound enough good wood, a decent roof, 4 windows that all had their glass still in them, which was something. The desks were of varying sizes and origins, pressed into rows with the haphazard logic of someone who had simply gathered whatever was available. The blackboard was cracked along one side but workable. There was a wood stove in the corner. A broom leaned against the wall. Helen set down her satchel, took stock of it all, and felt the specific, clarifying satisfaction of a problem she knew how to solve. She spent the rest of that week preparing. She visited the families in and around Caldwell who had school-age children, and she learned their names and their situations. She met the Hargrove family, cattle people, with 5 children between 6 and 14, and the mother, Clara, who pressed biscuits on her and asked in a voice carefully stripped of hope whether the new teacher was likely to stay past the summer. She met the Fontaine family, a French trapper named Auguste and his half-Osage wife, Marguerite, who had twin boys of 9 who ran faster than anything Helen had ever seen, and who spoke 3 languages between them. She met the Ray's family, whose daughter Lucia was 10 and whose father worked the cattle pens and whose mother was a seamstress, and who told Helen quietly but with great dignity that Lucia was the brightest child she had ever seen and that she was counting on Helen to see that too. Helen saw it. Helen saw all of it. This was what she was for. She opened the school on a Monday morning in the last week of April 1878 with 11 students. By the second week, she had 14. By the end of May, she had 19, including 2 brothers aged 8 and 10, named Thomas and Willis Garfield, whose father ran the livery stable on the south end of town, and who had apparently spent the previous 2 years acquiring a comprehensive education in how to avoid being educated. She managed them without raising her voice in any way she could avoid it, and the ones who came to school expecting the same rough authority they found everywhere else in Caldwell were somewhat puzzled by her, and then, over time, oddly loyal. It was the beginning of June when she had her first real encounter with Simon Bishop. He came to the schoolhouse at the end of the afternoon when the last children were filing out into the honey-colored evening, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was, she would learn, the closest thing to courtesy he had in his immediate repertoire, and said, "You're the new schoolteacher." "I am," she said, without looking up from where she was erasing the blackboard. "And you are the town marshal, Simon Bishop, Helen Pritchard." He seemed to be waiting for something, so she turned and looked at him. In the slant of the late afternoon light, he looked older than she had first supposed, and also less entirely impenetrable. There was something behind the set jaw and the level gaze that she could not quite name yet. She filed it away. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" she said. "Willis Garfield," he said. She waited. "The boy's been getting into things he shouldn't," Simon said. "I've spoken to his father. Frank Garfield's a decent man, but he's got more work than daylight. The boy needs—" He paused, and she could see him selecting his words with the care of a man who did not spend much time in this kind of conversation. "He needs something to occupy him that isn't trouble. He's been in school every day this week," Helen said. Something shifted slightly in Simon's expression. "Has he?" "He's smarter than he thinks he is, and he knows it's going to be a problem for him eventually," she said. "Children like Willis generally come around when someone convinces them that being capable is worth more than being slippery." Simon Bishop looked at her for a long moment. "You think you can do that?" "I've done it before," she said, and turned back to the blackboard. She heard him replace his hat. "All right," he said. He said it the way a man says something he doesn't quite believe yet but is choosing not to argue with. Then he left. She did not watch him go, but she thought about him that night in her room at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, sitting at the small desk by the window with the sound of the town drifting up from below, the piano from the Lone Star Saloon, the distant lowing of cattle in the pens, the occasional bark of a dog. She thought about the way he had stood in the doorway of her schoolhouse asking, in his own blunt fashion, for help with a child he had no formal obligation to worry about. She thought about what it meant that he had come at all. It seemed to her that a man who came to a schoolteacher about a boy who was not his own, a boy who was simply getting into things, he shouldn't, that man, was not entirely what he appeared to be on the surface of things. There was a core of something there, something that cared, even if it did not know how to show the caring in any form that could be called gentle. She did not decide anything about it. She simply noted it, the way she noted things that she did not yet have a category for. June moved through the way June does in southern Kansas, with a heat that arrived daily like a declaration. The school day began earlier and earlier in an attempt to catch the cool morning air before it burned off, and Helen adapted along with everything else. She was good at adaptation. She was, she thought, better at it than she was at most things. She saw Simon Bishop perhaps 3 times a week. Caldwell was not a large town. She saw him on the street in the mornings, making his rounds with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who expected the day to come to him rather than the other way around. She saw him occasionally in the evenings when she took her walk to the edge of town and back, which she did most nights for the air and the quiet. She saw him once at the general store, where he was buying coffee and salt pork, and a box of cartridges with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man whose relationship with the world was entirely transactional. They were not friends. She was not sure they were even acquaintances in any comfortable sense. But they spoke when they met, and the speaking had a quality to it that she noticed, a directness, a lack of the social performance that characterized most of her conversations in Caldwell. People in Caldwell performed themselves at her to varying degrees. They were friendly, or they were suspicious, or they were elaborately welcoming in the way people are when they need something. Simon Bishop was none of these things. He simply said what he meant and waited to see what she said in return, and if her answer was inconvenient for him, he acknowledged it without resentment and moved on. She found this, she realized gradually, genuinely restful. The trouble came in the middle of June, on a Thursday afternoon when the air smelled of the distant storm front pushing in from the northwest. She was walking back from the school to the boarding house along the main street when she heard voices raised in the alley beside the Lone Star. Not the roisterous arguing of men who had been drinking. She had learned to recognize that particular music, but something sharper and meaner. She stopped. Two men were leaning against Willis Garfield, who was pressed against the alley wall with his arms over his head. The men were not large, but they had the quality of meanness that size never quite explains, a practiced carelessness with other people's pain. Willis was 11 years old, and he looked, in that moment, very much like the child he was, which was not something he generally permitted the world to see. Helen walked into the alley. She was aware that this was inadvisable. She did it anyway. "Get away from that boy," she said. The men looked at her with the particular contemptuous amusement that some men produce when confronted by a woman speaking with authority. One of them said something that she did not dignify with acknowledgement. "You will leave him alone," she said, "or I will go directly to the marshal, and before I do I will visit every reputable establishment in this town and tell them exactly what kind of men you are, which is cowards who lean on children." The amusement faded from their faces, replaced by something less comfortable. One of them said, "You've got a mouth on you for a schoolmarm." "Yes," she said, "I do." They left. They did not leave gracefully, and they said things as they went, but they left. Willis Garfield straightened himself up from the wall and recollected his dignity, with the speed of someone who has had practice at that too. He did not thank her. He looked at her with an expression that contained several layers of feeling he did not have the words for yet and was not sure he wanted to have. "Go home," she told him, not unkindly, "and come to school tomorrow. You've got a test on long division." He made a sound that might, under generous interpretation, have been agreement and went. She was on the main street again, walking at her usual pace, when Simon Bishop appeared at her side. She did not know where he had come from. He simply arrived the way weather arrives. "I saw," he said. "Then you saw it was handled," she said. "Those men are trouble." "Most things in this town are trouble at one time or another, as far as I can tell," she said. But they responded to a woman speaking plainly to them, which suggests they have enough sense left to calculate consequences, which means they are manageable trouble. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You shouldn't have walked in there." "No," she agreed. "Probably not, but someone had to." He looked at her sidelong. There was something in the look that was not criticism exactly. Something more complicated than that. She did not dissect it. "Willis comes to school every day," she told him, which was what she had told him she would accomplish, and which she knew he would find relevant. "He's doing the long division." Simon Bishop almost smiled. It was barely a thing, the faintest alteration around the corners of his mouth, but she caught it. "All right," he said, as he had said before, and he walked back toward the jail. She stood on the board sidewalk for a moment after he had gone and found that she was smiling, quietly, and for no particular reason she was willing to examine in any detail. There was a social gathering at the end of June, not quite a dance, because the Ladies' Improvement Society, which was the nearest thing Caldwell had to a governing body of propriety, had decided that a full dance in June was premature for some reason that Helen never quite untangled, but a gathering with food and fiddle music, and the general goodwill that the town produced occasionally the way a difficult man produces occasional moments of sweetness. It was held in the largest of the town's churches, which was the Methodist one, and everyone who was anyone in Caldwell was expected to attend. Helen wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that was somewhat too warm for June but was the best she had. Mrs. Aldrich told her she looked lovely and meant it. She walked to the church with Mrs. Aldrich and the Fontaine twins, who had attached themselves to her for reasons she didn't question, and who spent the walk debating in French and English whether the fiddler would play any reels. He played reels. He played hymns. He played something no one could identify, but which made the older men nod with a private satisfaction. People ate corn bread and beans and dried peach pie, and Helen talked with Clara Hargrove about her oldest daughter's progress in reading, and with Marguerite Fontaine about whether there was any chance of getting a second teacher for the younger children, and with the Methodist minister, Reverend Greer, who was a small, gentle man with enormous side whiskers who told her that her being here was an answer to prayer, which she thanked him for sincerely. Simon Bishop arrived late. He came in the way he did most things, without ceremony or announcement, and stood near the door for a while with a cup of something and the expression of a man who has come because someone told him he ought to rather than because he wished to. He spoke to a few of the men. He accepted a plate of food from Mrs. Aldrich's friend, Mrs. Holly's, who was the town's most determined hostess, and ate it standing up. He did not dance. Helen was watching the Fontaine twins attempt to teach a younger boy the steps of something that appeared to be a combination of a reel and a pursuit when she became aware that Simon was standing beside her. She did not start. She had begun to expect him when she least expected him, which amounted to a constant state of readiness which was not uncomfortable. "You didn't tell me there was to be music," she said. "Would you have come for the music?" he asked. "I come for the children," she said, "but the music is welcome." She paused. "You don't seem to be enjoying yourself." "I don't enjoy gatherings," he said. "Then why are you here?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to most questions. "The Reverend asked me," he said, and it seemed to matter to him. She looked at him then. He was looking at the room in the steady, observant way he looked at everything, the way a man keeps his hand near his gun not from aggression but from habit, always watching, always cataloging, always ready. It occurred to her that this must be exhausting. She wondered whether anyone had ever offered him the option of not being ready for a moment. "Would you like some air?" she said. He looked at her. "I find that gatherings are considerably more enjoyable if one steps outside briefly and remembers that the world is larger than the room," she said. He considered this. Then he said, "All right." They stood on the church steps in the warm June dark, and the music came through the walls in a muffled, golden way, and the stars were extraordinary over the Kansas plain, the kind of stars that city people never believe until they see them, dense and burning and indifferent and beautiful. Helen breathed it in. Simon Bishop stood beside her with his hands at his sides, and she could feel him doing something that she thought, tentatively, might be the thing she had been seeing underneath the surface of him all along, simply being without managing or enforcing or containing. "You're from Kansas originally?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "Came here in '74. What brought you?" A pause. "Work," he said. She let it sit. Then, "Do you like it, being a marshal?" He seemed genuinely taken aback by the question, as if the concept of liking or disliking the thing you did had not occurred to him as a useful measure. "I'm good at it," he said. "That isn't the same thing." "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't." The music shifted to something slower inside. The stars burned on. "Why teaching?" He asked then, and she could tell it cost him something to ask it, some admission that he was interested in the answer. "My mother was a teacher," she said. "She taught in Lawrence for 20 years. She used to say that you could tell what a town actually believed about its future by whether it had a schoolhouse and whether the schoolhouse had a good teacher. She paused. Caldwell has a schoolhouse. I intend to be the good teacher. He looked at her then. Not the sidelong look he usually gave her, but a direct, assessing, complicated look that had several things in it she did not have names for yet. She held it. I think you probably will be, he said. It was the most open thing he had said to her. She recognized it as such. She did not make a large production of it. Thank you, she said simply. They stood a moment longer and then went back inside, and the evening continued, and nothing of dramatic note occurred. And yet Helen walked home to Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house that night with the sensation that something had shifted in the architecture of her daily life. The way a foundation settles and becomes, in settling, more solid. The summer brought heat and cattle and trouble, as summers in Caldwell generally did. The cattle drives pushed through on the trail, and the drovers came to town in their familiar waves of dust and hunger and money to spend, and the saloons lit up like lanterns, and Simon Bishop worked every day with the patience and iron competence of a man who knows his ground. Helen kept her school through July and into August, which was unusual. Most schools in cattle country broke for summer along with the drives, but she had proposed to the school committee that a summer session for children who wished to attend was worth attempting, and the committee had agreed largely, because it cost them very little and might keep some of the children from involving themselves in activities that cost the committee considerably more. 11 of her 19 students came through the summer. She taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, and she taught them history with a particularity that surprised some of the parents. She told them about the battles of the Civil War with an honesty about the reasons for it that was not universally comfortable, and she told them about the Osage and the Comanche and the Cheyenne not as obstacles to civilization, but as peoples with their own history and their own rights, which was not the version of events they generally encountered. Marguerite Fontaine, who was half Osage herself, and who sometimes came to stand in the schoolhouse doorway on her way past, said to her once afterward, "You do not have to do that, you know." "Tell them the truth about us," Helen said. "I think I do, actually. It's the only useful thing I know how to do." Marguerite looked at her for a long moment and then said something in Osage that Helen did not understand and walked on. But after that, when Auguste Fontaine sent the twins to school, he occasionally sent preserves or dried venison with them, placed in Helen's hands by twin boys who recited their instructions with the solemn care of diplomatic envoys. It was in late August that things between Helen and Simon Bishop took a turn that was sharper than either of them had perhaps anticipated. There was a difficulty at the school. A man, one of the drovers passing through, a man named Calhoun who had been in Caldwell 3 days, and who had opinions about schoolteachers and the kind of things they ought and ought not to be teaching, came to the school in the afternoon when Helen was still there tidying, and told her with a particular ugliness that she had no business filling children's heads with nonsense about Indians, and that if she continued, he would see to it that the committee knew about it. Helen was not afraid of him, which she recognized as either courage or poor judgment, and had not yet decided which. She told him that she taught what was true, and that the school committee had hired her to teach and not to trim the truth to anyone's preference, and that if he had concerns about the curriculum, he was welcome to raise them with the committee chairman, whose name was Mr. Aldous Webb, and whose office was on the north end of Main Street. Calhoun put his hand on the door frame in a way that was meant to make the doorway feel smaller. She did not move. He said something else, and she said something back, and then Simon Bishop was there. She did not know how he knew. She thought perhaps he simply walked the town enough that nothing in it was far from his attention for long. He did not come in loudly or with any dramatic announcement of his presence. He simply came through the doorway past Calhoun with the particular physical confidence of a man who does not calculate whether he will be accommodated but simply moves and trusts that the world will move around him. "Calhoun," he said. Calhoun turned. "The drives are moving out tomorrow," Simon said. "I expect you'll want to be with them." It was not a question. It was not technically even an order. But Calhoun heard what was underneath it and chose, wisely, to go. Simon Bishop stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse after Calhoun had gone and looked at Helen. She was standing quite straight, as she had been standing since the moment Calhoun arrived, and she was looking back at him with an expression that contained gratitude and also something slightly defiant, as if she was not entirely comfortable with having needed the intervention. "Thank you," she said. "He's a blowhard," Simon said, "but the type can get difficult. I'd rather it didn't." She nodded. Then, because she was honest and because silence between them had become the kind of silence you could say things into, "I don't enjoy needing assistance." He studied her. "I know," he said, "but that's not the same as it being wrong to accept it." She blinked. It was, she thought, the most perceptive thing he had said to her. They stood in the tidy schoolhouse in the late afternoon heat, and something between them that had been nameless for 2 months acquired the beginning of a name. Not quite a word yet. The suggestion of a shape. He left. She finished tidying. She walked home through the golden dust August evening and thought about the look on his face when he had said it, that careful, effortful thing, not gentle exactly, but trying toward it, trying toward something. The trying mattered, she thought. The trying mattered enormously. She wrote a letter to her mother in Lawrence that night. It was primarily about the school and the students and the summer session. "At the end," she wrote, "there is a man here who I think is good, though it is not an easy goodness. I find I am interested in the project of understanding him, which is perhaps not entirely prudent, but I have never let prudence stand entirely in the way of interest." Her mother wrote back 10 days later and said, "In my experience, the ones who are not an easy goodness are often the ones most worth understanding, once they begin." September came in like a change of mind, sudden cool after the heat, the cattle drives thinning, the town settling into its autumn character, which was quieter and more deliberate and smelled of wood smoke and the dry grass smell of the plains. Helen's school population returned to its full complement. There were 2 new students. A girl of 12 named Anne Beaumont, whose family had come from Virginia to Homestead, and a boy of 7 named Gabriel Reyes, Lucia's younger brother, who was shy and serious and who put his finger on every word he read as if he was pinning them down before they could escape. Helen loved her school with the private, fierce love of someone who has found their actual purpose and knows it. She also, by September, had arrived at the clear knowledge that she was falling in love with Simon Bishop. She sat with this knowledge for about a week before she decided she was going to have to do something with it, which was not her preferred approach, but which the situation seemed to require. She did not, in fact, have to do very much. The situation had its own momentum, which she had perhaps underestimated. It began on a Saturday afternoon when she walked out to the edge of town for her usual walk and encountered Simon doing the same thing, which surprised her until she reconsidered his habits and realized that she had simply never happened to walk at the right time before. Or possibly she had and had not paid attention. He fell into step beside her without either of them needing to discuss it, and they walked together in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have established that their silence does not require filling. They walked out to where the land opened up past the last buildings, past the cattle pens and the last scatter of sheds and outbuildings, and out onto the open prairie where the grass was going gold and dry in the September cool, and the sky came all the way down to the edge of the earth. Helen loved this place. She loved the sky most of all, the enormous Kansas sky that made a person feel both very small and oddly, very free, as if the vastness was permission. "You walk out here often," she said. It was not a question. "Every week or so," he said, "when things are quiet." "You don't live anywhere that's quiet." "No," he said, "the marshal's office is over the jail, it's not quiet." She laughed, which surprised her slightly. It surprised him too, she could see it, the brief startlement in his expression at the sound of her laughing, followed by something that warmed the flat line of his mouth. "How long have you been a lawman?" she asked. "Since I was 23, he said. Started as a deputy in Springfield, came to Caldwell in '74 as deputy, took over as marshal in '76. 8 years, she said. 8 years, she thought about that. 8 years of standing between one kind of trouble and another. 8 years of being the point of contact between order and disorder, which required a kind of permanent readiness, a permanent withholding of softness, because softness was a liability. She thought she was beginning to understand the shape of him more clearly. "Did you choose it?" she said. "Or did it choose you?" He was quiet for a moment. They were walking slowly along a cattle track that curved gently westward, and the late afternoon light was the color of old brass. "My father was a hard man," he said finally, carefully. "I learned early how to stand between things. It seemed like a useful thing to know how to do." She did not push at that. She let it sit. "You are good at it," she said, as he had said of himself, and she said it the way she had, as a clear fact. But then she added, "I wonder sometimes what you would be like if you didn't have to be." He stopped walking. She stopped 2 steps later and turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the careful surface he usually showed the world, but something underneath, something that was almost raw. Surprised by her, she realized. Genuinely surprised that she had said it and meant it. "I don't know," he said. "No," she said. "I don't suppose you'd have had much opportunity to find out." She paused. "But you're still here, so the opportunity isn't gone." He looked at her for a long time. The sun was moving down toward the flat horizon, and the grass moved around them in the dry autumn wind, and the town of Caldwell was a collection of small shapes behind them. She waited. "Helen," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. "Simon," she said. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more difficult and said, "I don't know how to do this." "What specifically?" she said, because she thought it mattered to be specific. He gestured at the space between them, which was perhaps 2 feet, and then at himself in a way that seemed to include his entire history. "This," he said. "Any of it. I'm not." He stopped. "Tried again." "I'm not the kind of man that—" "Stop," she said, not harshly but clearly. "Stop deciding in advance what kind of man you are and what you can or cannot do. You came to my school to ask me to help a boy who wasn't your responsibility. You came through a doorway when I needed someone. You said something true to me that I needed to hear. Those things are not the actions of a man who cannot do this." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm suggesting that what you are is more than you think." Simon Bishop looked at her with the full weight of whatever it was he kept behind the careful surface, and she held it without flinching. "I don't know how to be gentle," he said. It came out rough and honest, and possibly the most naked thing he had ever said aloud. She felt the truth of it, and she felt something else alongside it, the complete, unambiguous certainty that she was staying anyway. "Then we'll figure it out," she said. "Together. You'll learn, and I'll stay while you do, and then I'll stay some more after." He looked at her for a long time with the sunset behind him and the wind in the grass. Then he reached out carefully, with the hands that she had first seen pulling a man from the mud, those strong, rough, ungentle hands, and took one of hers in his. He held it the way a man holds something he is afraid of dropping, which is to say, with tremendous care. It was the gentlest thing she had ever seen. "All right," he said, and this time it sounded entirely different than the other times he had said it. This time it sounded like something beginning. They walked back to town in the early dark, still holding hands, and the stars came out over the Kansas plain, and Helen Pritchard thought, "Yes, this is the one. This difficult, contained, trying man. This one." October was a revelation. She had thought that the pace of his unfolding would be slow, and in some ways it was. Simon did not suddenly become a different man or acquire a natural ease he did not possess. But the quality of his attention to her was extraordinary once he had decided to give it. He was the most observant person she had ever known, and he turned that full observational power on her, with the result that he noticed things about her that she had not told anyone, that she ate very little breakfast because she was always too interested in getting to the school to slow down for it. And he began, with complete casualness, to leave a wrapped biscuit and a piece of dried fruit on the step of the schoolhouse before she arrived, with no note and no acknowledgement. That the cold bothered her hands when she wrote on the blackboard in the morning, and that a pair of good wool gloves appeared in her mailbox at the general store without any indication of their origin, though she knew. That she sometimes stayed too late at the school and walked back through the dark, and that he began to walk past the schoolhouse on those evenings as if by coincidence, and walk her back to the boarding house without making a substantial event of it. He was learning. He was learning what he thought of as the language of caring for someone, which he had not spoken since he was a small boy and his mother was alive, and he was learning it with the same determined, effortful competence he brought to everything. It was not elegant. It was not the practiced gallantry of the men who read novels about what courtship was supposed to look like. It was entirely itself, and entirely his, and Helen found it more moving than any amount of practiced gallantry would have been. She loved him. She was sure of it by the middle of October, and she did not see any reason to keep it a private piece of information indefinitely. They were sitting on the step of the school one evening after she had finished for the day, in the last warm light before October turned fully cold, and she had been telling him about Gabriel Ray's, and the way he had that day read a full sentence aloud for the first time without his finger on the words, had simply looked at the page and read it, as if the barrier between the marks and the meaning had dissolved all at once, and the look on the boy's face. She was describing it with the enthusiasm she brought to these stories, and she looked at Simon partway through and found him watching her with an expression so unguarded and warm that she stopped speaking entirely. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was listening. You were looking at me." "I can do both," he said, and the ease in it, the small, dry ease, made her laugh. "Simon," she said after a moment. "Helen, I love you," she said, because she had never seen much use in making people wait for things they needed to know. The silence that followed was the kind that has substance in it. She did not fill it. She watched him take it in, watched him the way she watched her students when they encountered something that was going to require the building of a new understanding. "I don't," he started and stopped. He set down the cup of coffee he had been holding and looked at her with something she could only call helplessness, which was so entirely unlike him that she felt a sharp tenderness for it. "I haven't," he tried again. "I'm not practiced at—" "Simon," she said gently, "you don't have to make a speech, you just have to tell me the truth." He looked at her. Then he said, quietly and with the absolute certainty of a man who has finally found the word he needed, "Yes, just that. Yes." But she understood everything in it. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, which flustered him to a degree that she found completely wonderful, and he sat very still for a moment like a man recalibrating all of his equipment, and then he turned and looked at her and said, "You are going to be the most complicated thing that has ever happened to me, aren't you?" "Almost certainly," she said. "All right," he said. And then he smiled, not the almost smile she had seen on that first day in the street, but a real one, which transformed his face in a way that made her feel as though she was seeing the thing that all the containment and hardness had been protecting all along. It was a very good face. It was the face of a man who cared more than he had ever had permission to show. She stored the smile up. She was going to want to remember it exactly. November came with cold and the particular solitude of the plains in autumn, and the town of Caldwell closed in on itself somewhat, the way things do when the weather turns and the drives are done, and the work becomes the work of simply maintaining and enduring until spring. Helen kept her school. Simon kept his rounds. They spent their evenings together with increasing regularity, sometimes at the boarding house parlor where Mrs. Aldrich, who was not unintelligent, gave them privacy disguised as housework, sometimes walking in the cold air, which Helen preferred because the cold sharpened everything and the stars in November were extraordinary. They talked. This was what Helen most loved about him by November. He talked to her. It had come slowly, like a well filling in a dry season drop by drop, then more steadily, until one evening she realized that he had been speaking for an unbroken half hour about his years as a deputy in Missouri, and the particular difficulties of that work, and that she had not had to prompt him or ask a single question. He simply talked, and the talking had a quality of relief in it, of something long held being let down. He told her about his mother who had died when he was 12, and about his father who had been the kind of man who expressed everything through his hands in ways that left marks. He told her about this without sentimentality or self-pity, simply as fact, but she heard what it had made of him, the lockdown quality, the permanent readiness, the reflex to contain rather than express. She held the information with care. She did not try to fix it. She simply acknowledged it and let him know she had heard. In turn, she told him things. She told him about Lawrence and what it had been, a town that still carried the burn of Quantrill's raid in 1863, 15 years gone but not forgotten, not by the families who had lost people. And she had been 9 years old and had seen things she did not describe, but which had shaped her conviction that teaching was a moral act. She told him about her father, who had been kind and somewhat uncertain in the way of kind, uncertain men, who died of a fever when she was 18 and left her mother alone in a schoolhouse with a small income and a large library and a daughter who was already clear on her direction. She told him about the previous teaching positions, a stint in Ellsworth, a year and a half in Dodge City which had its own sort of education to offer, and about why she had taken the position in Caldwell when it came. "You wanted a place that needed you," he said. She considered it. "I wanted a place where the needing was real," she said, "where there were real children who hadn't already been given a good start, where what I did actually made a difference to the shape of things." He was quiet. "Then it does." "I think so," she said. "I hope so." He reached over in the dark of the November evening and took her hand, which he was getting better at the taking of her hand. The first time he had done it on the prairie in September, it had been so careful that it was almost painful to watch. Now he did it with something approaching ease, which he had earned through practice and through the quiet revolution of deciding that this was something he was allowed to do. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. That was the whole thing, really. That was the love story of it in miniature. Two people choosing to hold on, choosing to stay, choosing to squeeze back. December brought an event that tested them in a way that the ordinary weather of their courtship had not. There was a man named Harlan Cross who had been causing difficulties in the county for the better part of a year, a cattle thief and a bully, and it was increasingly clear, a man who had done worse things than stealing cattle and was becoming dangerous in the way that men become dangerous when they feel their freedom to operate as they please being threatened. Simon had been building a case on Harlan Cross with the methodical patience he brought to all of it. And in the second week of December, it came to a head when Cross and two associates rode into Caldwell in the late afternoon, with what appeared to be drinking on their minds, and what turned out to be considerably more on their agenda. Helen was not there when the confrontation happened on the main street. She was at the school, which she had stayed late at because she was preparing materials for the end of the year, a kind of informal recitation she had planned, where the children would demonstrate what they had learned to their families, which was something the town had not had before, and which Helen was very invested in getting right. She heard the shots. Even at the distance from the school to the main street, she heard them, two of them, sharp and flat in the cold air, and the sound of them went through her like cold water. She did not run into the street. She had enough presence of mind to not run into whatever was happening, which cost her something. She stood at the schoolhouse door and waited with her heart going hard in her chest and the cold December air coming in around her shoulders. Mrs. Aldrich came for her 20 minutes later. She had her coat on over her house dress, and her face was controlled in the way that women's faces control themselves in emergencies, and she said, "He's all right. It's all right. He took a graze is all." Helen walked to the jail with Mrs. Aldrich's hand in her elbow, and she was very calm and very deliberate in the way she was calm when she was frightened, which she recognized in herself, and considered neither a virtue nor a flaw but simply the shape of how she worked. Doc Garvey was there. Harlan Cross was in a cell, and his two associates were in the other cell, and Simon Bishop was sitting on the edge of the desk with his jacket off, and a bandaged arm and a look on his face that was the marshal's face, composed and alert and already thinking about the next thing. He looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. She made the assessment the wound was on the upper left arm, the bandage was white and not soaking. The man himself was upright and lucid and annoyed rather than impaired. She crossed the room and took his face in both her hands because she needed the contact and said, "Don't ever do that to me again." His composure cracked just slightly, just enough. He covered her hands with his and said, "I'm all right." "I know you're all right," she said. "I said don't do it again." He made a sound that under any other circumstances would have been a laugh. "Helen, Simon." They looked at each other and she felt the whole precarious business of caring for someone, the vulnerability of it, the sheer terror of loving a man whose job asked him to stand between danger and the town, and she did not flinch from it. She had told him she would stay, and she had meant it in all its dimensions, including this one. "Thank you," she said, which was not quite what she meant to say, but which was true. "For what?" he said. "For being good at what you do," she said. "For being careful enough to still be here." He turned his head and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, which was the most tender gesture she had yet received from him. Doc Garvey made a diplomatically blind study of his medical bag. Mrs. Aldrich said something about tea. Harlan Cross was sent by freight wagon to the county seat the following morning, along with his two associates, and enough paperwork to ensure that they would not be troubling Caldwell or its county again for a very long time. Simon's arm healed cleanly. He was back at full capacity within a week, which he would have been in 3 days if Helen had not been sufficiently firm about the importance of allowing wounds to close properly before testing them. He resisted her nursing with the stubbornness of a man who has never had anyone nurse him, and is not entirely sure what to do with it. He told her he was fine no fewer than 7 times on the second day. She told him that she was sure he was fine, and that he was also going to keep his arm still until Friday, or she would take it up with Doc Garvey in a way that would embarrass them both. He gave her a look that was about 3 parts exasperation, and 1 part something warm and reluctant that she recognized as love being expressed in the grammar available to him. She gave him a book. He read it, all of it, a copy of Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans that she had in her bag, which he consumed with the focused attention he brought to everything, and which produced a lengthy and surprisingly feeling conversation about the depiction of frontier peoples and what it meant, and what the actual history underneath the romance of it was. Which was a conversation Helen loved having, and which Simon approached with the seriousness of a man who has lived in proximity to those actual people, and has his own thoughts about the distance between the story and the fact. She loved him more after that conversation than before. She had not thought she had room for more. Christmas in 1878 in Caldwell was a modest thing, as it generally was in a cattle town in a year when the drives had not been quite as profitable as expected. But it had warmth in it. The Methodist Church put on a pageant in which 3 of Helen's students played roles with tremendous seriousness, including Willis Garfield, who played a shepherd and who had, in the 4 months since Helen had taken him on as a project, transformed in the quiet, nonlinear way that children who are fundamentally capable transform when someone gives them a reason to bother. He was not a different boy. He was more himself. Helen's recitation had happened on the Friday before Christmas, and it had been everything she had hoped. The children stood in front of their families in the schoolhouse, which she had cleaned and decorated with spruce boughs that the Fontaine boys had brought, and they read aloud and recited and demonstrated the arithmetic they had learned, and Gabriel Reyes read a full paragraph without his finger on the page, and his mother sat in the front row with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright. Simon came. He stood at the back of the room in his good jacket, which he wore on occasions when he decided they warranted it, and he watched all of it with the expression she had come to know as his equivalent of visible emotion, the concentrated attention, the slight lift at the corner of his mouth, the quality of stillness that was not indifference but its opposite. Afterward, when the families had gone and the children had gone and Helen was extinguishing the lamp in the schoolhouse, he said, "You built that." She looked around the tidy room, the cleared blackboard, the small decorations, and knew he meant more than the room. "We all built it," she said. "No," he said. "You did. You came here and you decided what it was going to be and you made it that." He paused. "That's not nothing. That's—" He stopped, hunting for the word. "That's what I'm for," she said, but she said it warmly, knowing what he was trying to say. "Yes," he said, "that's what you're for." He came across the room and put his hands on her face with a care that still astonished her every time because he was still learning it and every time she could see the learning in it. "And I think," he said, "that you are the best thing that has ever come to Caldwell, Kansas." She leaned into his hands. "I think the same about you," she said, "though you are considerably harder to argue that case with." He kissed her then. He had kissed her before, but he was getting better at it in the way he was getting better at all of it with practice and attention and the specific kind of stubbornness that in him translated to commitment. It was a good kiss. It was a real one. "Simon," she said against his mouth. "Helen, Merry Christmas." He made the sound that was his laugh. "Merry Christmas," he said. January and February were deep winter, and the plains of southern Kansas in winter have a quality of absolute desolation that is either defeating or beautiful depending entirely on the state of your interior life. For Helen, it was beautiful. She had her school, her children, her work. She had Simon, who came most evenings to the boarding house parlor or to the schoolhouse, and who was by now, through the sheer accumulated momentum of their evenings and conversations and walks, and the business of each choosing the other repeatedly, undeniably, recognizably in love with her in a way that was visible to everyone in Caldwell who paid any attention. Mrs. Aldrich paid attention. She told Helen one evening in February, with the satisfied air of a woman who has seen something through, "He looks at you the way my husband used to look at me. Like he can't quite account for the fact of you, and has decided to stop trying and simply be grateful." Helen thought this was one of the most beautiful things anyone had ever said to her. It was in February, on a cold and star-blazing night when the temperature had dropped and the frozen ground rang under feet like iron, that Simon Bishop asked her to marry him. He did not do it on bended knee. That was not him, and they both knew it. He did it on the front step of the boarding house, having walked her back from a supper at the Reverend Greer's, with his hat in his hands and the cold breath going up in white clouds between them, and he said, "I know I am not the easiest man. I know I don't do things easily or softly or the right way most of the time. But I am learning, and I intend to keep learning, and I want to do the learning with you. I want—" He stopped and looked at her with the full, unguarded, complicated realness of him. "I want you to be my wife, Helen. I want to build the kind of life with you that I haven't known how to want before." She had known it was coming. She had known for weeks, in the way you know something that you haven't been told but that the evidence has made inevitable. She had her answer ready, and it was the same answer she had been giving him all along, the answer she had given the first time she said she was staying, the first time she chose him again and again in all the small ways that love is made of. "Yes," she said. "Simon, yes." He put his hands on her face again, the careful hands, the learning hands, the hands that would never be entirely soft but that she no longer needed to be, because what they communicated was not softness but care, and care was the deeper thing. He kissed her in the freezing February night with the stars burning over them. They were married in April of 1879, on the first warm day that year, which seemed right to Helen's spring, the season she had arrived in, the season of beginning. Reverend Greer married them in the Methodist Church, and the entire town of Caldwell came, which was somewhat bewildering to Simon and entirely unsurprising to Helen, who had known that a town is its people, and that its people are invested in the story of it. The Fontaine boys brought wildflowers, which was above and beyond what had been asked of them. Clara Hargrove cried openly and cheerfully. Willis Garfield sat in the third row with his best clothes on, and a look of concentrated dignity that was so endearing that Helen, who was not given to crying at her own wedding, nearly broke. She wore the blue wool dress, and her mother's brooch and her hair in the careful arrangement that the Kansas wind was consistently trying to dismantle. Simon wore a jacket and a clean white shirt and the badge, because he was the Marshal of Caldwell and he was who he was, and she would not have had him be otherwise. He held her hand through the ceremony with the gentle grip that had started as such effort, and had become, over the months, simply the way he held her hand. When Reverend Greer said the words and he said yes, "I will," he said them with the certainty of a man making a decision he has been building toward for a long time, and she heard all of it in the two words. They moved into the house that had been prepared for them. The marshal's position came with a house, a proper one on the north side of town, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch facing west so the sunsets came full into it. Helen hung curtains that she had made herself, practical ones that nevertheless had some color in them, and she arranged her books along one wall of the main room, and she brought her mother's rocking chair that had come on the stage from Wichita, and the house became a home with the particular speed that happens when 2 people who have been waiting, each in their own way, for the right place to put their belongings finally find it. Simon painted the porch railing. He did it one Saturday morning in May without telling her he was going to, and she came outside and found him painting it, and the careful attention he was giving to even the corners and undersides, the thoroughness of it, the refusal to do it halfway, made her understand again what she already knew, which was that this was his kind of love. Thorough, attentive, all the way into the corners. They settled into the life of it in the way that real life settles, with ordinary days and difficult days and very good days, and the accumulation of small moments that do not seem significant at the time and turn out to be the entire thing. He had a temper, which she had known. It was not directed at her. It was never directed at her, but it was present, the old edge of his father's sharpness that he had absorbed and was working to put down. There were days when the marshal's work brought its worst to the door and he came home carrying it, and the carrying sat in the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw, and she knew it when she saw it. On those days she did not push and she did not require anything of him, and she gave him the room to set the weight down in his own time. He learned, across those months of the first year, that setting it down was possible, that he was allowed to come home and be somewhere that did not require the permanent readiness, that the house was safe in the particular way she had made it safe, and that she was not going to leave if he showed her the parts that were difficult. He came to her one evening in the autumn of 1879 with the week's difficulty evident in his face, and she simply held out her hand and he took it and sat beside her on the porch in the last light and said nothing for a while and then said, "I don't know why you're so patient with me." "I'm not patient with you," she said. "I'm committed to you. It's different." He looked at her. "Patience implies I'm waiting for something to change," she said. "I'm not waiting, I'm here, this is where I want to be." He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "I keep thinking you'll realize I'm not what you deserve." "Simon," she said with considerable firmness and a great deal of love, "you are exactly what I chose. Do not argue with my choices." He kissed her temple and she felt him exhale, the particular exhalation of a man putting something down. "All right," he said, and this time the words had his whole self in them. They had their first argument in November of 1879. It was about something that seemed small. He had made a decision about the house, a practical one involving the winter wood supply and the placement of the woodpile, without discussing it with her, and she had come home to find it accomplished. She told him, clearly and without anger but with the directness that was her own particular nature, that she was not a woman who required things to be arranged for her without her knowledge, that she was a partner in this household and expected to be consulted. He listened with the expression he had when he was taking something in seriously. Then he said, "You're right, I didn't think to ask, I should have." She had been prepared for an argument and the lack of one surprised her into a moment of silence. "That's it," she said. "Yes," he said. "You're right, I'm sorry." She looked at him. He looked back. Then she said, "I was prepared for this to go on a good deal longer." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been wrong before," he said. "I know what it looks like." "You are very strange," she said with great affection. "I am," he agreed. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him and felt his arms come around her with the sureness they had acquired, no longer tentative, no longer the careful uncertainty of a man afraid of dropping something, but the full, sure grip of a man who has decided that what he has is worth holding. They were well. They were, she thought, very well. In the spring of 1880, Helen discovered she was pregnant. She was not surprised. She had been expecting it. But the reality of it arrived with a force that was something beyond surprise. She sat with it for 2 days before she told him, not from doubt but from wanting to hold the knowledge alone for a small while before it became a shared thing. She told him on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the porch, which she had claimed as their primary talking place in the way that certain spaces in a house or life become the sacred ones. She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her with immediate attention, the way he always did. "We're going to have a child," she said. The expression that came over Simon Bishop's face was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen on it. He had been across their months together many things focused, careful, tender in his careful way, occasionally almost open. But this was something she had not seen before. It was a breaking open, a complete and irrevocable surrender to something good. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Helen." "Simon." He reached for her and held her with an urgency and a care that were both in it at once, the full complexity of him in a single embrace, and she felt him shaking slightly, which he would have denied with his last breath, and she held on. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm very, very well." "Is it are you?" He was not entirely capable of sentences, which she found wonderful. "Everything is fine," she said. "Everything is going to be fine." He pulled back and looked at her with the open face. "I don't know how to be a father," he said. "No," she said. "But you're already learning how to be a husband, and you're doing admirably at that, so I expect the rest will follow." He looked at her and she could see him do the thing he had been doing since September of 1878. Take the thing she offered him, the clear certainty of her belief in him, and choose to hold it instead of putting it back. He was much better at it by now. "All right," he said. "You keep saying that," she said warmly. "I mean it every time," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I like it." He kept his hand over hers the entire evening, and she was quietly, enormously happy. The summer of 1880 was hot, and the town of Caldwell moved around Helen's pregnancy with the particular collective tenderness that towns sometimes produce for someone they have claimed as their own. Mrs. Aldrich delivered things, food, advice, company, with the regularity of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for the well-being of people she loves. Clara Hargrove sent over a quilt she had made herself. Marguerite Fontaine came twice a week in the later months, and was pragmatic and knowledgeable in the way of a woman who had given birth to twins, and had very clear views on what was useful in that situation, and what was ceremony. Helen taught through June and into July, and she was enormous and cheerful about it, and her students treated her condition with a mix of fascination and extreme solemnity, as if the presence of a baby in progress in the room required a kind of reverence. Gabriel Reyes brought her water every morning without being asked. Anne Beaumont had, by now, decided that she was going to be a teacher herself and spent her afternoons learning everything she could from Helen, which Helen encouraged with her whole heart. Simon became, in those months, something she had not entirely predicted, attentive to the point of vigilance. He checked in at the school in the mornings. He came home at noon when he could. He was not anxious in a hovering way but in a thorough way, the same thoroughness he gave to everything, and she was touched by it and occasionally needed to remind him that she was having a baby and not sustaining an injury, and that she was perfectly capable of walking to the well. He said, "I know." And then he went to the well himself. She loved him so thoroughly by now that it was simply the medium she moved in, the way air is the medium you breathe. She did not think about it as a new discovery. It was settled, foundational, given. Their son was born in September of 1880, in the house on the north side of Caldwell, with Doc Garvey and Marguerite Fontaine and Mrs. Aldrich all present, and Helen working the way she worked everything with focus and determination, and the refusal to be defeated by the difficulty of it. It was a long night and an early morning, and when it was done she was exhausted in a way that went all the way through and also more awake than she had ever felt. Simon was allowed in when it was finished. He came to the side of the bed with the hat in hand's uncertainty he had shown that very first day in the schoolhouse doorway, which made her smile because she knew what it meant and had always known that the uncertainty was not inadequacy but care. He looked at the child. He looked at her. "He's very small," he said with some concern. "He's the correct size," said Marguerite Fontaine from the corner crisply. "He looks like you," Helen said. Simon looked down at the baby with an expression that she stored in the deepest place she had, the full open face, the breaking through. He reached out one hand and touched the baby's fist with one large finger, with the care of a man touching something that he knows is precious and fragile and irreplaceable, and the baby's fist closed around his finger, which is something that babies do and which is nevertheless the most extraordinary thing in the world every single time. Helen watched Simon Bishop, who did not know how to be gentle, hold his son's hand with more gentleness than she had thought possible in him on the day she first saw him, and she thought, there it is. There is the whole of it. They named him James, after Simon's grandfather, who had apparently been the one decent man in a sparse history of decent men on that side of the family, and after Helen's father, whose middle name it was. James Bishop, born in Caldwell, Kansas, in September of 1880, who opened his eyes on the 10th day and was revealed to have his mother's eyes, and who almost immediately demonstrated that he had inherited both his father's determination and his mother's capacity for very clear communication of his needs. He was the first child of what would, in the years that followed, become a family in all the fullness of that word. Caldwell grew. The cattle trade shifted and changed as the decade moved forward. The railroad lines changed the routes, and the drives wound down as the years went on, and the fencing of the open range changed the character of the plains. But the town endured and developed and became, gradually, something that had some permanence to it. Helen's school grew too. By 1882, she had enough students to warrant the second teacher she had proposed to Marguerite Fontaine in their first weeks of acquaintance. And that teacher was a young man from Missouri named Thomas Hart, who was good and willing, and who arrived somewhat bewildered by what he had taken on, and was set right within a month by Helen and the organized chaos of 19 children who were all quite clear on what a real teacher was and what they expected. Anne Beaumont, who had announced her intention to teach at 10 years old, was by 1883 13 and helping in the school in the afternoons with the younger children, learning the craft of it the way Helen had intended she should. Helen told her once, watching her sit with Gabriel Reyes's younger sister over a reading lesson with a patience and a warmth that was entirely natural, "You have it, the thing that makes a real teacher, I hope you know that." Anne looked up at her with the clear-eyed certainty of a girl who is beginning to understand what she is for. "I know," she said simply. Helen recognized the answer. It was the same answer she had given Caldwell when it asked whether she could do this. "Yes, I know." And she had been right. Simon remained marshal through 1883 and into 1884, when an offer came from the county seat, a higher position, more pay, the kind of advancement that made logical sense on paper. He brought it to her in the evening on the porch as he brought all the significant things and laid it out. She listened, she thought, she asked him what he wanted. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think I want to stay." "Tell me why," she said. "Because I know this ground," he said. "Because the people here," he stopped, looked at the town in the evening light, the familiar shapes of it, the glow from the church windows, the sound of the fiddle from somewhere. Because James takes his first steps on this street, he said. Because your school is here. Those are good reasons, she said. And because I'm not done yet, he said. There are things here that still need doing. She knew what he meant. The injustices that accumulated at the edges of the cattle economy. The homesteaders cheated out of their land. The workers who were owed wages never paid. The Osage who came through and were treated by some as if their presence on land that had been theirs for generations was a trespass. Simon had been the kind of marshal who noticed these things, and within his power, addressed them with the same thorough application of what was right that he gave to everything else. It had not made him universally loved, it had made him effective. Then stay, she said. He looked at her, just like that. Just like that, she said. It's your decision, Simon. I've told you what I think, which is that you should go where you believe you should be. This is where you believe you should be. He was quiet. Then he said, I thought you might want to go somewhere, a bigger town. Better, Simon, she said. Look at this town, look at what we've built here. Look at your son who takes his first steps on this street. She gestured at it all, the porch, the house, the town in the early dark. This is mine as much as it is yours. I am not looking for somewhere else. He took her hand. Held it the way he held everything, completely, the way you hold something that is the most important thing you have. All right, he said and smiled. In 1884, Helen had their second child, a daughter born in November, who arrived with considerably more speed and dramatic insistence than her brother had, and who announced herself to Caldwell with a volume that reached the street outside. They named her Clara, for the first friend Helen had made in this town, and Helen held her and felt the particular full sensation of a life that is, genuinely and without reservation, the life you were supposed to have. James Bishop was 4 years old and was already fully himself, his mother's directness, his father's observational thoroughness, a combination that produced a child who noticed everything and said exactly what he noticed, which was occasionally mortifying and generally wonderful. He examined his new sister with a seriousness that made everyone in the room smile and then said, She's very loud. She is, said Helen. Like you, said James. Simon Bishop laughed outright, which was still, 6 years into knowing him, one of Helen's favorite sounds. Exactly like me, Helen agreed. Clara Bishop grew into her name and then some. She was, it became apparent, the kind of child who knows what the room needs and provides it warmth, laughter, the specific ease of someone who is completely comfortable being where they are. She was the complement to James's focused determination, and the two of them together were, as Simon said to Helen once with a kind of wondering helplessness, more than either of them had prepared for. But they were prepared. That was the thing. Helen had spent her whole life preparing to be here, and Simon had spent his whole life, without knowing it, without having had the permission for it, becoming the man who could be here with her. The man who held his wife's hand with both of his at the end of the day, who painted porch railings into the corners, who read every book she put in front of him and had opinions about all of them, who came to the school recitations every year and stood at the back of the room with the badge on his jacket and the warmth in his face that was only for her, and for the children they had made, and for this town they had decided to mean something to. In 1886, Willis Garfield, who was by now a young man of 19 and working at his father's livery, came to Helen and told her he wanted to find out how to become a teacher. He said it with the particular gruff embarrassment of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided to say it out loud, and she received it with the fullness of attention that it deserved and told him every single thing she knew about how to go about it, and where to write, and what to study, and who might help. He became a teacher 3 years later. He taught in a county school north of Caldwell, and Helen received a letter from him in the spring of 1889 that said, "You are the reason for this. I want you to know." She put the letter in the box where she kept important things, alongside her mother's letters and the first drawing James ever made and the dried flower from the small bunch Simon had given her on their first anniversary, with the wordless, slightly formal air of a man, attempting a new language and determined to get it right. The town of Caldwell, Kansas, changed with the years. The cattle drives ended in their great era. The railroad took the commerce in new directions. The open range closed and the plains were fenced, and what had been a wild, lawless, thrilling, violent, beautiful edge of the country became something more settled, more ordinary, more seamed with the marks of human intention. Some people mourned it. Helen did not particularly. She had never needed the wildness. She had needed the real, and the real was still here, in the faces of the children who came to her school, in the morning light on the Kansas plain, in the man who sat beside her on the porch every evening of their life together. Simon Bishop retired as Marshal of Caldwell in 1891. He was 44 years old and had given 18 years of his life to the law, and the town gave him a send-off that embarrassed him considerably, and that Helen attended with the open smile of a woman watching the people she loves be fully seen. He was not certain at first what he was without the badge. She had anticipated this. She put him to work on the school building. There were repairs needed, and he was thorough and capable and needed the purpose of something real to do. And she watched him discover, over the weeks and months, that there were other things he was made for besides standing between danger and the people he was protecting. He helped Reverend Greer with the church repairs. He taught James to break a horse in the way that a good horseman does, with patience rather than force, which required him to practice the patience himself, and which he did with the determination he had always brought to learning things that did not come easily to him. He sat on the porch in the evenings and read, and talked and held his wife's hand. He was, Helen thought one evening in the autumn of 1891, watching him sit with Clara in his lap while the girl read aloud from one of Helen's school books, with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old who considers reading a competitive event. He was, finally and fully, himself. Not the man who had only the capability of hardness, not the man who had been made by his father's hands and his years of managing other people's violence, but the whole man, the one that had always been there underneath, the one she had seen in September of 1878 on the open prairie with the grass going gold and the sun going down. "What?" he said, looking up and catching her watching him. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." Clara looked up from the book. "Mama is doing the looking at Papa thing again," she announced. "I see that," Simon said with perfect seriousness. "She does that." "Why?" said Clara. "Helen said, because I like looking at him." Clara considered this with the thoroughness of her father and the directness of her mother. "All right," she said, and went back to the book. Simon's mouth moved into the full smile, the real one, the one she had caught in the schoolhouse in December of 1878 and stored up. It had not become less valuable with repetition. It had become more so. The years settled around them like the best kind of weather, not without change, not without difficulty, but fundamentally good. James grew into his father's build and his mother's certainty, and went east for 2 years of schooling and came back to Caldwell because, as he told his parents at 20 years old with the earnest clarity of a young man who has examined his options, there was nowhere he would rather be. He took over the livery stable from Frank Garfield when Frank retired, which surprised some people who had expected something more dramatic from Helen Pritchard's son, and which Simon understood entirely. "You take care of the ground, you know," he had told Helen once, and James had apparently arrived at the same conclusion through his own path. Clara grew into a version of herself that was everything the infant in 1884 had promised, full of light, and decided in her opinions, and kind in the way that people are kind when they've been shown kindness as an act of principle rather than performance. She married, at 22, a young man named David Cole, who had come to work at the new train depot, and who looked at Clara with the same expression Simon had been giving Helen for 15 years, which Helen found entirely satisfying. Helen herself taught in Caldwell School through 1893, when she passed the school fully to Thomas Hart and Anne Beaumont Cole, Anne having married that David Cole's older brother, which had been a coincidence of the most satisfying kind, and became instead the kind of figure in a town who is not exactly in charge of anything formally, but who is the person people come to when they need someone to think clearly and speak truly. She sat on the school committee. She helped establish the town's small lending library, which she stocked with the care she had given every other project of her life. She corresponded with teachers across the county and the state, because the work she believed in, the only reliable thing you can give another person, did not stop being her work just because she had put down the chalk. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, in April of 1899, Simon made her breakfast, which he had been doing most mornings for the past several years with the thoroughness he had always brought to learning things. He was not an elegant cook. He was a thorough one, which produced food that was reliable and ample and warm. He set it on the table and sat across from her, and they ate in the companionable quiet of 20 years together, the kind of quiet that is not silence but something richer, all the accumulated mornings of a shared life, laid in like firewood. After breakfast she poured the coffee and they took it out to the porch, as they always did, and the April morning was extraordinary, the first real warmth of spring after the long winter, the light coming in at a low, gold angle over the Kansas plain, the grass new green at the far edge of the yards, the town beginning its day with the sound she knew as well as she knew her own breath. Simon sat beside her with his coffee. His hair was going gray at the temples, which had been happening for a few years and which she found, privately and absolutely, handsome. He was still broad-shouldered and still had the quality of occupying space with total conviction. But there was something easier in him now, something that had been released over the years into a kind of settled peace that she had not been sure in those first months that he would ever find his way to. He had found his way. He had worked for it with the determination he had always had, and she had stayed while he worked, and then she had stayed some more. 20 years, he said. 20 years, she agreed. Are you sorry? He said. Not with anxiety, not any more. With the genuine curiosity of a man who still wanted to know what she thought, who had never stopped wanting to know. I am the opposite of sorry, she said. I am the most unsorry person in Kansas. The corner of his mouth. That's very specific. I'm a teacher, she said. Precision matters. He reached over and took her hand in his. She felt his thumb trace across the back of it in the small, habitual gesture that she could not imagine her life without. I used to think, he said, that I wasn't built for this, for he gestured at the house, the town, the hand held in his, all of this. I know, she said. You didn't believe it, he said, even then. You didn't believe I was right about myself. No, she said, I didn't. Were you sure, he said, in those first months, were you sure? She considered the question honestly because she had always given him honesty. I was sure that what I saw in you was worth staying for, she said. Whether it would become what it has become, I had hope, not certainty. But I've always thought that hope and the commitment to act on it are worth more than certainty anyway. He looked at her. You might be the bravest person I know, he said. She laughed. Simon. I mean it, he said. I know you do, she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she fit against as if she had always fit there. The April light moved on the porch boards. The town made its morning sounds. Somewhere a bird was taking apart the morning with a song so ordinary and beautiful she could have cried. I learned, he said after a while, everything you said I would. You did, she said. And you stayed, he said, the whole time. I did, she said. His hand tightened over hers. And now? She raised her head and looked at him. The face she had been looking at for 20 years, the face she had put in her memory so many times that she knew every version of it, the morning face and the working face and the rare fully open face and the smile she had stored up on a December evening in a schoolhouse in 1878. She looked at all of it. And now I am going to stay some more, she said. He smiled. The real one. The whole one. The spring air moved around them, and the day opened up into all its ordinary, irreplaceable fullness, and Helen Pritchard Bishop and Simon Bishop sat on their porch in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1899, and held on to each other with the certainty of people who have chosen and kept choosing, every morning, every year, in all the ways that love is made and maintained and built into something that holds. It held. It held them well.